Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Ginna Husting, and with Dentith and Marty Orr, want to present some results from some ongoing research that we're doing together. Some even fear calling it conspiracy theory. Response to Michael J. Wood. Thank you. Next. So by way of introduction, our question here is, does conspiracy theory act as a pejorative? And of course, sometimes it's claimed that labeling something a conspiracy theory does work in a pejorative fashion. Examples include Blair and Bush's labeling of critics of the Iraq invasion as conspiracy theorists. Of course, Woodward and Bernstein's story got met with the accusation by the Nixon White House. More recently in the US, in 2016 election, claims or worries of interference were called or labeled conspiracy theory from both sides of the aisle. And next would be great.
That is, Jen, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, thanks.
Yeah, I jumped the gun.
Very, very clever. But conversely, sometimes the pejorative aspect, right, fails to land. It eventually became accepted in the US and earlier, and I think in the UK, that the rationale for the invasion of Iraq was predicated on more than one lie, in fact. That while Woodward and Bernstein initially faced trouble, eventually Nixon did resign. And finally, in the 2016 election, it didn't stop investigations into whether those claims were true. It did retard them to some extent. So whatever we think of conspiracy theories, something interesting is going on with the label. And so in this presentation, we want to look carefully at Michael Wood's 2016 paper, which is called "Some Dare Call It Conspiracy." Labeling something a conspiracy theory does not reduce belief in it. Here, Wood argues that while we can reasonably understand conspiracy theory as an epithet that's used to shut down debate and silence critics, the ever-presence of conspiracy theories in mainstream media have essentially defanged the term so that it doesn't really have a punch anymore. It doesn't have much of an impact on whether people are likely to believe or accept an underlying claim of conspiracy. And so in this paper, we want to make three main points. First, Wood's arguments are important and they're provocative, but they also sidestep some of the research that he says he's responding to. And those who have cited this work as definitive often overlook the strong limitations of his data. Third, we argue that his work is, again, important but limited and needs further study. So we're going to conclude with data from a new study as we attempt to reopen the case. Okay, so just by way of a bit of history, Wood argues that his findings contradict the position taken by scholars like Bradich, David Cody, DeHaven Smith, and the two of us, Husting and Orr from 2007. Additionally, Wood didn't consider or mention other prior work that we relied on, including Pigden, Basham, Knight, Pelkmans, and McCold, and of course, Dentith, who also noted the pejorative use of the term and argued it was unwarranted. And our initial work showed that the phrases conspiracy theory and the phrase conspiracy theorist are used as mechanisms to attempt or try to control and manage conspiracy claims and claimants by neutralizing them. That is, they are part of interactional strategies or machinery that people use to minimize or marginalize particular claims in public political discourse. Wood's study, though, looks at a different issue, and that is whether the use of the phrase can dissuade people in surveys from anonymously agreeing with a claim. Data from two experiments that Wood did and summarizes in this paper are that to which we now turn. We want to show you that they don't measure the rhetorical power of the phrase conspiracy theory in general, and they don't track it across a variety of specific contexts. So now we're going to critique Wood a little bit. So Wood did 2 experiments. They're survey experiments. In the first one, he used an online Amazon MTurk sample of about 150 people who were asked to rate the likelihood of belief in various conspiracies. For half of that sample, those claims were labeled ideas. For the other half of the sample, those claims were labeled conspiracy theories. Wood found no evidence across those 2 halves of his sample that the label changed likelihood of belief. And that's a good start. That's pretty interesting. But the small sample size, it's a very small sample, is a very strong caution against generalizability of this experiment, especially since he has to then split a sample in half. A larger sample would strengthen findings. And just as a quibble, Wood himself notes in the paper elsewhere that the MTurk respondents tend to skew younger and less affluent, which would really disproportionately impact or bias small samples like this first one of 150. So given the small sample of the first study, the first experiment, this work should be treated as suggestive, but not definitive at all. So that's our first point. More importantly, I think for us, this first experiment doesn't capture or refute what other researchers were claiming and still are asking about. For example, Husting and Orr's key concern was popular political culture rather than the use of the term to change individual minds on an internet survey where someone is anonymous, because context matters. A survey used as a form of quasi-experiment strips out the messy complexities of context, intent, and the multiple effects of the phrase. And in a sense, this is a version of a lab versus field problem that we're highlighting here. We want to spell out or really make explicit that the label has different kinds of effects in different contexts. My calling you a name like communist or conspiracy theorist might convince you to back off or change the subject of an argument or conversation or debate without changing your opinion at all. And it could be the case that being called a conspiracy theorist would compel you to rethink your position later after the conversation is over, or after you've been, your idea has been labeled a conspiracy theory 4 or 5 times, but this isn't immediately obvious. Plus, sometimes, as we know from growing research, sometimes the label isn't, whoops, could you go back? Sometimes the label isn't used, no worries. The label isn't used to change minds, right? It's used to harass, to tease, to bond with people, to virtue signal, to create belonging or a feeling of belonging, etc., to create boundaries, to do boundary work. And thanks, Marty. Next would be good now. So there are lots of motives, goals, and intentions behind uses of the phrase. The effect of the label depends on the person, on the aspects of the situation they find themselves in. Those are measurable, but they haven't been with Wood's 2 experiments. So in other words, these things are messy, and they're linked with a wide variety of people's motives, intentions, goals in using a phrase like conspiracy theories. And what people intend is not always what they accomplish. What they intend varies across platform, context.
Jeez, I'm so sorry.
Okay, you're good. Marty, it's great. I like it. It's exciting. It's like, woo. Thank you for doing the slides, Marty. Okay, there are lots of motives and goals. Are we here? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, we're good. We could go to the next one. Okay, the second experiment, we're going to talk now about the second experiment that Wood did and presented in this paper. It's a stronger experiment. It has a stronger sample of 800. In this particular design, Wood randomly assigned respondents to evaluate claims from a mock news article on a fictional Canadian political scandal. Wood's respondents here were US based, so they're doing cross-national fictive political scandal. The scandal is described to one group as a conspiracy theory and to the other as corruption allegations. The change in wording he found, again, in this more robust sample, provided no statistically significant effect on people's opinions about the ersatz conspiracy. So it just didn't have an effect. And next, yeah. And Wood then concludes that this suggests that the conspiracy theory label possesses far less rhetorical power than previously assumed. Elsewhere, he says it's not a rhetorical weapon. And in fact, we think that it suggests that in these very specific circumstances, the label has little or no rhetorical power to influence people's belief. But he used a very weak prompt, a single occurrence in a news article about a political event that the audience had little or no investment in. He did not test for variations in frequency, context, who used it, against whom, and tone and medium count. Is it in print, political debate, casual conversation, tweet, where, in what context, who's listening, who are the audiences? Okay. Thanks. I turn it over to M.
Okay, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, good, because my internet is unstable, so if it turns out that I just disappear halfway through, one of you is going to have to take control. So you might ask, why does this matter? Why does a small study by Wood end up being the kind of thing that we as philosophers, sociologists, cultural historians, and the like need to be concerned with? Well, part of the problem is Wood does get cited, and does get cited quite a bit. And sometimes he's simply cited without there being any critical discussion and without any caveats whatsoever. So we've got some quotes here from Van Prugen and Van Vogt and Stojanoff, which indicate that people are just citing Wood as giving an absolute claim. And then if we move on to the next slide, we'll find that there are some examples where Wood does get cited as producing a conditional claim that, yes, it is the case that Wood has some suggestive findings, but there's no critical engagement. There's no investigation of exactly what is going on with the kind of claims that Wood is making here. Okay, so well, this suggests a particular hypothesis. It gets cited in the literature, and often we find that these citations then get cited again in further papers as if the science is kind of settled when it's not. So there's a little bit of a problem in the social science literature here, which indicates that, you know, maybe people should be engaging more with these findings in the first place before reproducing them and moving on. But for our purposes, if we move on to the next slide, it seems that within philosophy, Wood gets a lot more traction. And this traction ends up producing a very weird tension that I think we need to be aware of. So take, for example, Lee Basham. Lee likes to cite Wood as evidence that the supposed pejorative connotation of these terms conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists really aren't actually doing much work whatsoever. So we've got this quote from Lee's 2016, which he echoed again in 2016, as well as in papers in 2018 and 2019. And Lee is one of the most arch of the arch particularists out there. He really does say, look, the term conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists don't have the pejorative connotation that social scientists claim that it does. Ipso facto, particularism really should be the default view amongst people who study conspiracy theories. But conversely, if we move on to the next slide, we find that people who are working much more in the generalist position are also citing Wood, and they're citing Wood for the same kind of rationale. They're citing Wood in support of their generalist conception of the talk of conspiracy theory. So we have Hünemann and Worms writing about how Wood's study indicates that actually the term conspiracy theory isn't detrimental to its acceptance or diffusion. Giulia Napolitano, who along with Kevin Rutter, as we see in the next slide, also making a similar claim that it turns out that labeling a theory a conspiracy theory does not lead people to reduce their belief in that theory. Now, if it turns out that both particularists and generalists are citing the same study in support of their quite radically different conclusions, that we should either treat conspiracy theories seriously on the evidence, or we should accept that there is a sense that conspiracy theories are prima facie irrational, or at least at the very face of it, very unlikely and not worth considering seriously, then we should be engaging in an investigation of this particular study, because the particularist and the generalist can't both be right about wood if they're arguing for radically different conclusions. And that's the reason why we're concerned about actually taking Wood at his word, looking at those particular studies, seeing what actually comes out of it when we prize those studies apart, and actually then going on to test what it was that Wood is claiming to respond to, which of course is really what we're doing with work with respect to the new study, which Marty is going to talk about now.
Okay, I missed a slide there. I'm sorry. Again, Wood didn't really ask our question, but we want to ask his. It's an important one. A survey seems the way to do this. That's the sort of evidence that's treated by those folks as systematic. So we have a survey of a sample of 1,000. We use Qualtrics. And we chose the JFK example since we expected most people have an existing and longstanding opinion about that theory, and that it would be the sort of conspiracy theory that a modest prompt would be perhaps the least likely to change. So in each case, respondents used an 11-point slider scale to indicate that they were absolutely confident that the statement was false, 5 was unsure, or absolutely confident the statement was true, or a 10. The independent variable was one of 3 prompts. So our sort of control was this statement: the assassination of John F. Kennedy involved individuals other than or in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald. And so no mention of a conspiracy theory in this statement. Another third of the sample were given this statement: the conspiracy theory is justified. John F. Kennedy's assassination involved individuals other than or in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald. And here we introduce the phrase conspiracy theory, but the scare quotes clearly imply that those calling it a conspiracy theory are wrong in doing so, and the respondent is invited to share that perspective. So in a sense, the respondent is given permission to support the theory. And the third prompt was the unjustified belief that John F. Kennedy's assassination involved individuals other than or in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald is just another conspiracy theory. And here we're calling it a conspiracy theory, but in a more contextualized, conversational, and blatantly disparaging way. And the wording invites respondents to be either one of us, part of some in-group, or one of them, part of some out-group. And so a couple of ways to visualize this. We collapsed the 0 through 2 scores into a weak support. The scores closest to 5, moderate support, and then the 3 highest scores is a strong support. You can see that when conspiracy theory wasn't mentioned, 15.5% indicated weak support. And when we asked them with the term conspiracy theory in the phrase, it was about the same, 16.5%. But that third variation, just a conspiracy theory, the support for the JFK conspiracy theory, or support or lack of support for the lone gunman theory, if you will, more than double, which is pretty impressive. And we can run chi-square on that or Kramer's B, and they both are statistically significant. This is just another visualization of the same data collapsed. So you can see that the first and second prompts had similarly weak support, similarly moderate support, and similarly strong support. But the green bar, just a conspiracy theory, the support for the conspiracy theory just really drops off. And then we can also run a one-way ANOVA, and these are the 95% confidence intervals around the means there. So for people asked the prompt that did not mention conspiracy theories, the mean's roughly 6.25, about the same for the mention of conspiracy theory in the scare quotes. And then, of course, the big change, support for the JFK conspiracy theory really drops down to about 4.8 is the mean there. So the average support actually shifts below the midpoint of 5. And in addition, we collected demographic information, political beliefs, conspiracist attitudes, psychological dispositions, and created a dummy variable using the first and third variations of the prompt. So we could drop that into a regression. And other than the framing of the question, which was significant, there were some minor but statistically significant independent effects. Those supporting conspiracy theory, regardless of how it was asked, tended to be lower income, less religious, more inclined to support environmentalism for whatever reason, and less likely to be critical of mainstream news media. But interestingly, we asked the sort of questions that are used in these conspiracism scales, and we saw no effect in terms of belief in elite control of world events, cover-ups, paranormal, trust in government and secret societies. And in terms of the measures of personality defects, I guess, no effect on the respondents, regardless of how the question was asked, in anxiety, trust in others, enemy, authoritarianism. And I'll pass it back to Ginna.
Since Wood's analysis, at least 3 other researchers have failed to confirm Wood's conclusions, and they include Harambam and Oppers, Mackenzie McHarg and Freedom work, which is really nice and quantitative comparative historical work, and Nira Laveau and Klein in 2020. And their work aligns with our findings. They point to a problem in the transdisciplinary. And so the overall sort of issue here is that I think we're pointing to a problem in the transdisciplinary literature on conspiracy theories. We're calling for greater care and critique as philosophers and others treat 1 or 2 studies, experimental studies, especially quantitative studies, as definitive, or as they make, or as researchers make claims that overstep the bounds of methods and findings, because it really can end up as turtles all the way down. Science is still slow. It takes more than 1 study, and our literature reviews need to reflect caution and care as we summarize or use previous findings to set up our own arguments. And so Wood opened an interesting and important line of inquiry. It's fair to say that the label is used as an epithet and serves to silence debate. If so, you would expect that it's effective in changing people's opinions of the underlying issues. It's a great question. But we stand by the argument that conspiracy theory performs discursive work. And saying the claim is just a conspiracy theory, and these data appear to affect the way that people respond to a claim so labeled. And we found some very, again, provocative, interesting results that should eventuate in more research, both qualitative and quantitative. And I'm including philosophy as qualitative research. What our findings suggest then is that the nature of the effect is not entirely clear. And there's a difference between shutting down a conversation, an argument, a parliamentary debate, and dissuading people from believing in an argument or a conspiracy claim. Despite findings that are less than conclusive ourselves, we hope that as a complement to Wood's analysis, this research helps us to caution when we cite a limited number of studies as definitive proof of something, and that we also reopen the case and let the argument continue. Thank you.
All right.
Should I stop share?
Yeah, that might be good.
Okay.
Okay, so
Great.
despite there being 3 speakers, got in under time very nicely. We still have more than 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Would anybody like to chime in with a question? I'm curious, well, since we're waiting for somebody to jump in with a question, Em, I know you said you cut yours a little short, perhaps. Was there anything else that you were interested in making sure we got out?
Yes, I mean, first, I might just make sure that I can be heard because I keep getting these warnings. My internet is unstable, which is very awkward.
You have no
being
image.
so organizer.
I can hear your voice.
So one of the worries that you might have with the way that both particularists and generalists are using the same study to support not each other's work, their own work in contrary to someone else's work, is that the particularists are going, well, look, the label doesn't necessarily act as a stop for debate if we consider the label in its literal sense. Whilst the generalists are probably going, well, actually, it doesn't act as a stop for debate because some conspiracy theories still get discussed in society. So there is going to be a kind of way to square the circle here between the way that particularists and generalists are using the same set of studies to support their own individual research agendas there. But unless we actually spend some time looking at exactly what Wood is trying to do, and also looking at whether Wood is successful in actually getting to that particular response, we can't just be going, Wood is evidence of a particular position. Instead, we need to spend some time going, what is Wood trying to do? Is Wood getting there? And is he actually replying to the thing that he says he's replying to, which is the chief issue in that he's replying to Marty and Ginna, but he's not actually replying to what they said. He's replying to at best, a caricature of the claim that's found in Dangerous Machinery. So yeah, that's the thing I probably would have gone into slightly more depth if I hadn't been panicking about my internet connection just disappearing completely.
So I'm actually curious about I mean, we had Marius on before talking about doing this kind of work, qualitative and quantitative work in the field or in the lab in Germany. You folks, I'm not sure. Are your subjects likely to be Americans or? Yeah, I see nodding heads. Yeah.
These were adults in the U.S.
Yeah, and I also can't help but thinking that when we look at thinking back to Curtis's talk about Qassam, right? I mean, one possible hypothesis is that there's a greater concern with anti-Semitism in conspiracy theories and a greater historical involvement of anti-Semitism in British conspiracy theories, right? That there's a cultural dimension to this that that I imagine you folks have to kind of take into account when you're thinking about, especially if you're going to grab a population, show them the word conspiracy theory, and then ask whether or not it affects them. It seems like prima facie that's going to be affected by, is that population Australian? Is that population American? Is that population, from the backwoods of Idaho or wherever, right? There's going to be a different reaction perhaps. And can you speak a little bit to that and how as social scientists you're going to struggle with dealing with that cultural background?
Actually, so if I can just quickly jump in on this. So when the survey was being designed, there are a whole bunch of questions that probably reflected both our relative political knowledge of the US and our relative pop cultural knowledge of particular things. So we had a celebrity doppelganger question in amongst the set of questions we were polling on. And I did raise the question, is anyone under a particular age even going to know who this particular person is? So there was an awful lot of discussion going on with me as the New Zealander coming into it going, well, I can't answer this question because I literally don't know, but I also don't know whether that reflects on me simply being an outsider to the US or whether we need to rethink what that question actually looks like. Refers to.
So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Well, one is, looks like a comment from Charles. A term can be used as a discursive weapon, but that does not mean that it always works or that it works better in some contexts than others. But that does not mean that it always works or that it works better in some contexts than others. Any reaction to that? Yep, agreement generally. Okay. Logan asks, this makes me think about how generalists might be missing the point. While the prescriptive labeling of conspiracy theories does not stop conspiracy theorists from talking about their theories, it does keep them from gaining public prevalence among the general population. It forces conspiracy theorists to insulate themselves rather than debate about it in the public. It reminds me of Husting's and Orr's work about how the pejorative use of conspiracy theorist is often used to silence marginalized groups who talk about systemic oppression. It doesn't silence conspiracy theorists, but it builds a barrier of entry into the public. Yeah, not a question, but
it's a really nice comment, and it actually puts me in mind, I think, of something. Well, some parts of Curtis Hagen's treatment of Qassam, in that. Let me just pull up Logan's point. So yeah, I mean, I think at the end, I really liked this pulling in of Lao Tzu to think about, right, the authoritative intellectual or leader becomes an authoritarian, and the very question of what happened. So that one thing that Hagen's work made me think about is that there's a heavy recoil to using contempt and shaming against people that you want to call conspiracy theorists, and it's a very small point, but Logan's point seems relevant to that.
I mean, this also relates to Charles's comment as well. No one's ever making the claim that calling someone a conspiracy theorist acts as an absolute stop. The question is, does it change behaviors in discourse? And that's the concern. It may not be the case that, as we point out, calling me a conspiracy theorist changes my belief, but it might change my behavior in a whole bunch of different social situations. So whatever the stop is, it's very contextual.
So Marius has a comment, says not so much a question, just a remark. We had a replication crisis in psychology with about 35% of studies that stood the test of replication, 35% of studies that stood the test of replication. You excellently point out one of the reasons that might be underlying this crisis.
Thank you.
Fair enough. And then Melina has a question. Interesting study. Do you think there is a difference between calling known events as conspiracy theorist or not, and, for example, in conspiracy theory narratives?
And, for example, corruption in conspiracy theory narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is the classic question of, should we call known examples of conspiracies conspiracy theories? And I mean, I know amongst philosophers that actually seems to be something which is contentious. So David Cody, for example, will say, well, look, if it's propounded by an official source, it's not going to be a conspiracy theory, because official theories and conspiracy theories are different as labels. It's all theories about conspiracies if they involve them, but we don't call 9/11 a conspiracy theory if you take the Al Qaeda did it hypothesis. Well, Steve, as Steve Clark said in the panel at the beginning, he's quite happy to call things like that a conspiracy theory, and I guess for philosophers, they'll end up going, well, when I call something a conspiracy theory, they might put in the caveat, I'm using it in its kind of technical sense, even though I know that people in common discourse don't refer to it in the same way. And you'll get the people who go, well, we should revise those terms and only stick to the revised terms or the stipulated terms in debate. I mean, it would be interesting to see whether we could actually test that in this kind of setting by putting forward stipulated definitions and then going, all right, you've analyzed this claim in this particular way according to common language. Now we're stipulating if we use this particular term, do we get the same kind of result? And we kind of do that inadvertently with as Mahdi points out, the one where we're bringing people into the discussion. You know, those people call this a conspiracy theory. But I actually think there's probably a lot more work to be done about that particular type of question, because I think we might get some really interesting answers there, even though I don't want to even guess as to what those answers might look like, in case that then kicks me in the face later on.
Okay, I think this is going to be the last question from Jag. Says, I can think of a few pathways to parse out the kind of discursive force of quote unquote conspiracy theorist, but a few of those pathways would be concerned about how to scientifically capture these moments, because they would remove the person from the relevant context for the discursive intent. Can you talk more about how to capture the discursive feature of your account, which I really like, notes in parentheses, in social science?
Yeah, I'm going to try to actually rephrase the question, make sure I've got it right. Yeah, I think that, yeah, the concern is actually how to actually measure what we want to measure here, right? A question of validity in terms of the discursive force of conspiracy theorists. It's a really hard question.
I mean, so we've talked about how it'd be great to do some conversational analysis, so go beyond the survey thing and start talking about, you know, engaging with people in conversation and coding that stuff. Problem is it's time consumptive and also horrendously a lot more expensive than getting a survey through Qualtrics or MTurk.
Data scraping might be interesting, but data scraping has its own issues. But it would get a lot of data, and it would be really interesting to see how things shook out. Again,
yeah, because I mean, there's another project that we're working on, which is about sports conspiracy theories. And we did talk at one stage about scraping through Facebook posts to see how people talk about these things. But it turns out Facebook doesn't like you doing that. And if they catch you doing it, they ban you from the platform.
No, you have to pay them. If you pay them, then they might let you do it.
Yeah, but then it also turns out there's a whole bunch of issues there about the fact they won't give you all the data anyway. They curate the data, which at that point it completely nuises your study if they're not going to give you the stuff you're actually looking for.
Yes.
Yeah, and another thing we've talked about actually is just sort of throwing the door open ethnographically and just sitting down with people to talk with them in depth about what they believe, why they believe it, how the term matters to them, and how they feel or react when they use it, and treat people as though they're not cultural dopes and can actually speak for themselves about whether they think the phrase is an epithet or not, whether it has ever pushed them away, if they can give an example of that. And there are ways of getting at that. Doing that in a, you know, with a large random sample, at least at the beginning, isn't possible, but nobody's actually done that. And I think it's called for. Well, actually, Harambam and Uppers do that a little bit. And I think, yeah, but I think more of it among more groups of people, their very focused group is really, I mean, it's already suggested, but I think it could be done again and again.
Okay, well, we are at time, so we should thank our speakers as well as the speakers for this whole section. Thank you to all of you. We are about to take a 30-minute break, I believe.
We are indeed.
And so we will take a break. Everybody can stretch their legs and enjoy life away from the screen for a few minutes, but we will be returning in 30 minutes to hear another tranche, to use a word that Alex Jones seems to like a lot. Another tranche of talks.
Brian, if you're going to talk about tranches, you need to hold up a whole sheaf of paper. I've got a tranche of talks.
Oh, and you see, if you say bad things about Alex Jones, you get cut off. Okay, so let's take 30 minutes break, and I'll see folks back here in a few minutes. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.